every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The autumn air in Rexburg, Idaho, carries a particular kind of quiet. It's a clean, crisp silence that settles over the sugar beet fields and the tidy streets surrounding the university campus. It's the kind of quiet that speaks of safety, of community, of a predictable and righteous rhythm of life. But in the fall of 2019, that quiet was a mask. Beneath the placid surface of this devout, family-focused town, a different kind of silence was growing. The chilling, empty silence left behind by two missing children. It began, as these things so often do, with a simple phone call, a thread of concern pulled from thousands of miles away that would eventually unravel a tapestry of death, delusion, and staggering greed. When police knocked on the door of Lori Vallow Dable's townhome on November 26th, they were there for a routine welfare check. Her 7-year-old son, Joshua Jackson Vallow, known to everyone as JJ, hadn't been seen in weeks. The story they received was casual, almost dismissive. JJ was in Arizona, staying with a family friend. But the friend's name didn't check out. The phone number was a dead end. When officers returned the next day, the townhome was empty. Lori Vallow and her new husband, Chad Dable, had vanished, and with them, any hope of a simple explanation for the whereabouts of not just JJ, but his 17-year-old sister, Tylee Ryan, also vanished into the cold Idaho air. This case is not merely a story of missing children, nor is it a simple tale of murder. It is a labyrinth of manipulated faith, of apocalyptic prophecies wielded as weapons, and of a shared psychosis that sanctified the unthinkable. It is a story about how a charismatic mother and a self-proclaimed visionary systematically dismantled their own families, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a holy war fought against the innocent. We will explore how a bizarre and intricate belief system, built on visions of zombies and saviors, was engineered to serve three very worldly motives: money, power, and sex. We will trace the path from devotion to destruction, to understand how two people convinced themselves and others that to save a soul, you first had to destroy the body. To understand the vortex that consumed Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, we must first understand the two people at its center, Lori Vallow and Chad Dable. On the surface, they appeared to be products of the very culture they would come to corrupt. Lori, born in California, was by all accounts a magnetic and beautiful woman, a former pageant contestant, a dedicated mother, and a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She had been married 4 times before Chad, a history that hinted at a restless search for something more. Her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, was a successful businessman who doted on her and had adopted JJ, Lori's grandnephew who had special needs. They lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Friends and family described a Lori who was vibrant and deeply engaged in her faith. But over time, that faith began to change. She grew increasingly interested in the more esoteric, fringe beliefs that exist on the periphery of any mainstream religion. She became involved with a podcast and media group called Preparing a People, which focused on preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ. An apocalypse they believed was imminent. It was through this network that she discovered the writings of Chad Dable, a man who claimed to have the roadmap to the end of days. Chad Dable was, in many ways, Lori's opposite. A quiet, unassuming man from Utah, he had worked as a sexton, a gravedigger, in a Springville cemetery before starting his own small publishing company. He wrote and published dozens of books, fictional stories based on near-death experiences, and his own self-proclaimed visions of the future. He presented himself as a humble family man, married for nearly 3 decades to his wife Tammy, with whom he had 5 children. They lived a modest life in Salem, Idaho, just a few miles from Rexburg. But behind this veneer of gentle piety was a man constructing an elaborate spiritual hierarchy with himself at the top. Chad claimed that a near-death experience in his youth had torn the veil between worlds, allowing him to see spirits and communicate with the other side. He developed a system for rating people on a scale of light and dark. He could tell if a person's original spirit had been replaced by a demonic entity, turning them into what he called a zombie. He taught that he could see vibrations, and that he was chosen to lead a group of 144,000 righteous believers who would survive the coming apocalypse, scheduled for July of 2020. In this new world, he and his followers would be the saviors of humanity. When Lori Vallow met Chad Daybell at a religious conference in 2018, their worlds didn't just collide, they fused into a new, lethal element. Lori was immediately captivated by Chad's teachings. Here was a man who not only saw the world as she was beginning to see it, but who could give her a divine role within it. He saw her, he said, as an exalted goddess, his eternal wife from a past life. He told her that her then husband, Charles Vallow, was an impediment, a dark spirit. Soon, Lori began referring to herself as a goddess, destined to be with Chad and lead the 144,000. Their affair was not just a worldly transgression. In their minds, it was a celestial imperative. This shared belief system became the engine of their crimes. It was a bespoke theology, tailored to eliminate any person who stood in their way. The doctrine of zombies was its most sinister and effective tool. According to Chad, a person became a zombie when their mortal body was possessed by a dark spirit. The original righteous spirit was trapped, unable to progress until the body was destroyed. Killing the body, therefore, was not murder. It was a righteous act of mercy, a necessary spiritual cleansing. This belief provided the ultimate justification. It transformed murder into a holy sacrament. The first person to be branded with this spiritual scarlet letter was Charles Vallow. In early 2019, his marriage to Lori was disintegrating. He saw a profound and frightening change in his wife. She was no longer the woman he married. She told him she was a goddess, that she was on a mission for God, and that he, Charles, was a demon named Ned Schneider who was inhabiting his body. She threatened to kill him, claiming she had been commanded by God to do so, and that she would have angels to help her. Charles Vallow was terrified. He wasn't just losing his wife, he feared for his life and for the safety of the children. In January 2019, he called the police, pleading for a mental health intervention. He told officers about her claims of being a god, about her threats, about her sudden access to over $30,000 from their business account. But when police arrived, Lori presented as calm and rational. She skillfully painted Charles as the one who was unstable. No action was taken. Frustrated and desperate, Charles filed for divorce and sought a protective order. In the court filings, he laid out the bizarre beliefs in stark detail, stating, "Mother has recently become infatuated and at times obsessive about near-death experiences and spiritual visions. Mother has told Father that she is sealed, eternally married to the ancient Book of Mormon prophet Moroni, and that she has lived numerous lives on numerous planets prior to this current life." He explicitly wrote that he feared for his life. His fears were tragically prophetic. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to Lori's rental home in Chandler, Arizona, to pick up JJ. Lori's brother Alex Cox was there. An argument ensued. According to the story Alex and Lori told police, Charles became enraged, attacked Alex with a baseball bat, and Alex, fearing for his life, shot Charles twice in the chest. It was a clean story of self-defense. Alex Cox was a key figure in this saga, Lori's loyal enforcer. He had a prior criminal record, having served time for assaulting Lori's third husband with a taser. His devotion to his sister seemed absolute, and he appeared to fully subscribe to the dark religious fantasies she and Chad were spinning. The Chandler Police Department initially accepted the self-defense narrative, but there were troubling inconsistencies. Lori waited over 40 minutes after the shooting to call 911. In the intervening time, she took JJ to school and went to Burger King. When she finally returned, her demeanor was unnervingly casual. She was seen laughing with her daughter Tylee outside the home, while Charles's body was still inside. Weeks before the shooting, text messages later recovered showed Lori and Chad discussing Charles's death as a necessary step. Chad had even texted Lori a so-called blessing in which he prayed for Charles's demise, referring to him by the demonic name Ned. Within weeks of her husband's death, Lori attempted to claim his $1 million life insurance policy, only to discover that Charles, in his final months, had wisely changed the beneficiary to his sister, Kay Woodcock. With Charles Vallow gone, the first major obstacle to Lori and Chad's divine union was removed. The next obstacles were the children. In late August 2019, just over a month after her husband's murder, Lori abruptly moved with Tylee and JJ from their comfortable life in Arizona to a small townhome in Rexburg, Idaho. The move was sudden and secretive. She gave friends and family vague explanations. The true reason was simple: to be closer to Chad Daybell, who still lived with his wife Tammy just a few miles away. The move to Rexburg marked the beginning of the end for Tylee and JJ. They were isolated, cut off from the network of family and friends who loved them. Tylee, a vibrant and independent teenager, was about to receive a substantial amount of money from her late father's Social Security benefits. JJ, a sweet-natured boy with autism, required constant care and attention, care that Lori seemed increasingly unwilling to provide. According to friends who were part of Lori and Chad's inner circle, both children were soon labeled as dark or zombies. Tylee Ryan was last seen alive on September 8, 2019. She, JJ, Lori, and Alex Cox took a day trip to Yellowstone National Park. A photo from that day shows Tylee smiling, standing before the thermal pools, a seemingly normal family outing that concealed a monstrous reality. It is the last known image of her. The very next day, September 9th, cell phone data placed Alex Cox's phone in a specific location on Chad Daybell's property for over 2 hours in the morning. This location would later be identified as the Daybell family's pet cemetery. That same day, Chad Daybell sent a text to his wife, Tammy. It was a seemingly innocuous message, but in hindsight it was chilling. He told her he had shot a large raccoon and buried it in the pet cemetery. 2 weeks later, it was JJ's turn. On the night of September 22, 2019, family friends David Warwick and Melanie Gibb were visiting Lori in Rexburg. They later testified that JJ was acting up, being a typical 7-year-old boy. At one point, Alex Cox arrived and carried the sleeping JJ upstairs. It was the last time anyone outside of the inner circle would see him alive. The next morning, when Melanie Gibb asked Lori where JJ was, Lori nonchalantly replied that he had been acting like a zombie and that Alex had come to take him away. She would later tell people that JJ had gone to live with his grandmother, Kay Woodcock, in Louisiana, a lie that Kay would later expose, triggering the police investigation. On the morning of September 23rd, the day after JJ was last seen, Alex Cox's phone once again pinged on Chad Daybell's property, this time near a pond. The data showed him coming and going from that specific spot. The digital breadcrumbs left by Lori's loyal brother were creating a map of the atrocities he was committing on her and Chad's behalf. With the children gone, Lori was free, but there was still one more person standing in the way of her life with Chad, his wife of 29 years, Tammy Dable. Tammy Dable was a beloved school librarian, a mother of 5, and a respected member of her community. By all accounts, she was a kind and healthy woman, but in the worldview of Chad and Lori, she had become an obstacle. On October 9, 2019, just 10 days before her death, Tammy had a terrifying experience. She called the sheriff's office to report that a man in a ski mask had shot at her with what she thought was a paintball gun in her own driveway. She was unharmed, and the man fled. The incident was unsettling but was not connected to anything larger at the time. In retrospect, many believe this was a failed murder attempt, possibly carried out by Alex Cox. The second attempt, just days later, was successful. On October 19, 2019, Chad Dable called 911 to report that he had woken up to find his wife dead in their bed. He told authorities that she had been ill and had a coughing fit before going to sleep. She was only 49 years old. Despite the sudden and unexpected nature of her death and the recent report of an armed assailant, the local coroner ruled her death was from natural causes. An autopsy was declined by Chad. He seemed eager to have her buried quickly. The day after Tammy's death, Lori Vallow was online, shopping for wedding rings on Amazon. 2 weeks after Tammy Dable was buried, Lori Vallow and Chad Dable were married on a beach in Kauai, Hawaii. They exchanged rings, smiled for photos, and celebrated their celestial union. Back in Idaho and Arizona, their children were missing and their former spouses were dead. The web of lies they had told to friends and family was beginning to fray. The most persistent voice of concern came from JJ's grandparents, Larry and Kay Woodcock. Kay was Charles Vallow's sister, and she had maintained a close, loving relationship with JJ. When her regular FaceTime calls with her grandson abruptly stopped in late August, she grew increasingly worried. Lori offered a string of excuses, but none of them made sense. Finally, in late November, after weeks of being stonewalled, Kay Woodcock made the fateful call to the Rexburg Police Department, formally requesting a welfare check on her grandson. This single act of a grandmother's love set in motion the investigation that would expose the entire horrific enterprise. When Rexburg police knocked on Lori's door, she and Chad told them that JJ was with a family friend named Melanie Gibb in Arizona. It was a clumsy, desperate lie. The officers called Melanie Gibb directly. Unbeknownst to Lori, Melanie's faith in the couple had been shaken. She had grown disturbed by their talk of zombies and their callousness. When the police called, she told them the truth. JJ was not with her, and she hadn't seen him in months. She also told them that both Lori and Chad had called her, pressuring her to lie to the police and to hide the children's toys in her garage to support their story. Realizing their cover was blown, Lori and Chad fled. They left behind everything: clothes, furniture, and most importantly, any trace of Tylee and JJ. They went to Hawaii, the place where they had just celebrated their wedding, and attempted to resume their life as if nothing was wrong. But the world was now watching. The case of the missing children became a national media sensation. The smiling, carefree photos of the newlyweds on the sunny beaches of Kauai stood in grotesque contrast to the increasingly frantic search for Tylee and JJ. Law enforcement from Idaho, Arizona, and the FBI were now working together, piecing together the timeline of death and disappearance. They exhumed Tammy Dable's body. An autopsy revealed she had been asphyxiated. They re-examined Charles Vallow's death, now viewing it through the lens of a conspiracy. They tracked the couple to Hawaii, and in late January 2020, served Lori, with a court order demanding that she physically produce her children to Idaho authorities within 5 days. The deadline came and went. The children did not appear. On February 20, 2020, Lori Vallow was arrested in Kauai on charges of desertion and non-support of dependent children. She smiled for her mugshot. Even with Lori in custody, the central question remained: where were Tylee and JJ? The answer lay buried in the cold Idaho soil, on the property of the man who had prophesied a new world. The search for the children intensified through the spring of 2020. Investigators focused on Chad Daybell's sprawling property in Salem. They analyzed the cell phone data from Alex Cox's phone from the previous September, which gave them 2 specific points of interest. On June 9, 2020, a massive search operation began. The first discovery was made in the Pet Cemetery, the same area where Alex Cox's phone had lingered on the morning of September 9th, the day after Tylee was last seen. As an excavator carefully scraped away layers of earth, investigators found a melted green bucket. Inside were charred flesh, bone fragments, and clumps of hair. The remains were so brutally destroyed, dismembered, and burned that they had to be identified through DNA analysis. It was Tylee Ryan. The raccoon Chad claimed to have buried was his stepdaughter. The second discovery was even more disturbing. Near a pond, in the area where Alex's phone had pinged on September 23rd, investigators noticed a patch of sod that was different from the surrounding grass. Beneath it, they found large, flat rocks arranged in a layer, and under the rocks, they found the small body of J.J. Vallow. He was dressed in his red pajamas, his hands and feet bound with duct tape. His head was wrapped in plastic and sealed with more tape. He had been buried in a shallow, unceremonious grave. The sweet boy with the infectious smile, who loved his service dog Bailey, had been suffocated and discarded like trash. The discovery of the children's bodies was a moment of profound national grief and horror. It was the confirmation of everyone's worst fears. Chad Daybell was arrested on the spot as the remains were being uncovered on his land. The charges against him and Lori were swiftly upgraded to include first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The investigation had also uncovered a third key player in the conspiracy, Alex Cox, but he would never face a trial. On December 12, 2019, less than 2 months after Tammy Daybell's death, and with the investigation into the missing children heating up, Alex Cox was found dead in his home in Arizona. The official cause of death was a blood clot in his lungs, ruled as natural causes, but the timing was, to say the least, deeply suspicious. Many investigators believe he was either silenced or that the stress of his actions finally took its toll. He was the muscle, the loyal soldier who carried out the dirty work, and he took many secrets with him to the grave. The legal proceedings that followed were long and complex. Lori and Chad were tried separately. Lori's trial came first, in the spring of 2023. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented a mountain of digital evidence, text messages, location data, and search histories that laid bare the conspiracy. Witnesses from the couple's inner circle, like Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines, Alex Cox's widow, took the stand and provided chilling testimony about the religious doctrines. They spoke of casting out dark spirits, of people being graded on a light-dark scale, and of the casual, matter-of-fact way Lori and Chad discussed the deaths of their family members. The prosecution's narrative was simple and devastating. This was not about religion. This was about money, power, and sex. The bizarre beliefs were a tool, a convenient and custom-made excuse to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of the life Lori and Chad wanted together. Tammy Daybell was an obstacle to their marriage. Killing her, allowed them to be together, and for Chad to collect on her life insurance policy. Charles Vallow was an obstacle who stood between Lori and a $1 million life insurance policy, which she mistakenly thought she would inherit. Tylee and JJ were obstacles. They were a financial burden and a parental responsibility that interfered with Lori's new life as a chosen goddess preparing for the end of the world. Tylee's Social Security survivor benefits were collected by Lori for months after she was murdered, deposited into a bank account that Lori continued to use. Lori's defense team offered no coherent counternarrative. They called no witnesses. Their strategy seemed to be to simply argue that the state had not met its burden of proof. It was a strategy that failed spectacularly. The jury saw through the charade. On May 12, 2023, after just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Lori Vallow Dable guilty on all counts, including the murders of her 2 children and conspiracy to murder Tammy Dable. At her sentencing, Lori was given the opportunity to speak. She showed no remorse. Instead, she delivered a rambling, defiant statement filled with religious jargon. She claimed that Tylee, JJ, and Tammy were happy in the spirit world and had visited her. She insisted that no one was murdered in this case and that all deaths were accidental or from natural causes. "Jesus knows me, and Jesus understands me," she said, casting herself as a misunderstood victim. The judge was unmoved. Citing her complete lack of remorse and the heinous, calculated nature of her crimes, he sentenced her to multiple terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad Dable's trial followed a year later, in the spring of 2024. His defense team attempted to portray him as a pawn, a man manipulated by the beautiful and charismatic Lori Vallow. They argued that it was Lori and her brother Alex who were the killers, and that Chad was a victim of her influence, a man who loved his wife Tammy and was duped into a dark world he didn't understand. But the evidence against him was just as strong. The children were buried on his property. He had prophesied Tammy's death to his followers. He had lied to police and collected on Tammy's life insurance. The text messages between him and Lori revealed a partnership, a shared plan from the very beginning. The jury rejected his defense and found him guilty of the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. And because of the aggravating factors, the murders were committed for financial gain and were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. The jury sentenced him to death. The convictions brought a measure of legal closure, but the questions that linger are profound. The story of Lori Vallow and Chad Dable is a chilling case study in the power of shared delusion. It reveals how 2 narcissistic individuals can create a closed-loop reality, a feedback system where their darkest desires are reinforced and sanctified as divine will. Chad provided the theological framework, the cosmic justification. Lori provided the charismatic energy and the ruthless practical application. Together, they formed a perfect destructive storm. The anatomy of this case is the anatomy of a weaponized faith. It's about how the language of light and dark, of salvation and damnation, can be twisted to serve the most profane human impulses. Chad Dable did not invent a new religion from whole cloth. He curated and distorted existing concepts from the fringes of his faith to build a belief system that centered entirely on his own importance and his own desires. Lori Vallow was not a passive follower. She was an eager co-author of this deadly scripture, a woman who found in Chad's prophecies the permission she sought to erase her past and build a future free of inconvenient people. The tragedy is magnified by the vulnerability of the victims. Charles Vallow saw the danger and tried to sound the alarm, only to be disbelieved and labeled as the aggressor. Tammy Dable was a loyal wife, utterly unaware of the plot against her life unfolding in her own home. And most heart-wrenching of all, Tylee and JJ were children, entirely dependent on a mother who came to see them not as her children, but as dark spirits, as obstacles, as zombies that needed to be destroyed. Their final days were spent in the care of people who had already pronounced a spiritual death sentence upon them. In the end, the apocalyptic prophecies were just a fantasy. The zombies weren't real. The second coming never arrived. The only darkness that descended upon the Vallow and Dable families was the one they meticulously constructed themselves, a darkness built from a grotesque fusion of scripture and self-interest. It was a darkness that left behind it a void where a family once stood, and 2 shallow graves in the cold Idaho earth. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.